Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Carissa Kranz, your host, and we are live in the courtroom, live on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109, and live in the courtroom for the Shaun Harrison trial, the case out of Boston, where a reverend is accused of shooting a student that he mentored, execution style, for a drug deal gone bad. With me is defense attorney Andell Brown, criminal defense attorney. Andell, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure, Carissa.
So right now, for those of you listening in and those of you watching, the jurors look like they're about to be reseated after viewing the crime scene, the place where the Reverend allegedly, remember, he says it's not me, I'm just the Rev, but the place where the Reverend allegedly shot the student that he mentored in the back of his head, execution style, and the student is in court saying that's him. What do you make of the jurors being taken to the scene where this alleged intent to murder happened?
I think it always helps to have jurors actually see the scene and get a real feel for the things that are being talked about in court. Where were the cameras that we're talking about? What type of area is it? Is it secluded? Is it a busy area? Is it the type of area you would take someone if you didn't want someone to see you? So I think those things matter. Prosecutors like to do it. Defense attorneys sometimes like to do it. It adds context to the testimony that they're hearing.
And how often do you see this happen in a case that a murder was not actually executed? I mean, remember, this is an intent to murder case. The victim, Luis Rodriguez, survived, and he's taken the stand as a witness in this case. We just saw him on the screen right now, pointing to the place behind his ear where the bullet entered his head. How common is it for jurors to actually go and scope out a scene of a crime where no murder actually occurred?
It's not very common, Chris, and I think you kind of touched on that in that this is not a murder case. Typically, that type of expenditure of resources is reserved for murder cases, which are the most serious.
And that's a key thing you're saying, expenditure of resources, right? So the judge and the state needs to be accountable to taxpayers. I mean, it's an expensive field trip. You have buses, you have authorities to escort them. I mean, that's not a cheap excursion to go check out and scope out a crime scene.
Not at all. And especially in this case, I'm not sure what they hope for the jurors to gain from going to the scene that they wouldn't necessarily get from testimony, because it seems like it's really based on the credibility of the alleged victim says this was the guy that shot me. They have other witnesses coming in to say this guy was posing as a teacher, but he was living a double life as a drug dealer and a gangster. I don't know what the scene is going to tell them about that particular point.
I think we're going to have to throw to a quick break, but I think just to answer your question of what the scene may or may not glean light on, we don't really know because we're not familiar with the area. But the jurors are from the area, so they may go to the scene and they may see, this is a scene where gang activity seems to take place. It's a little seedy. It's a little sketchy. It would be, for us, just giving legal analysis, we're definitely interested, but I would assume that the jurors who are from the area, and that's the benefit of picking a jury pool that can bring unbiased experience to their deliberation room, could gain some insight from this excursion. Anyway, we need to throw to a quick break, but stick with us, and we're going to go back into the courtroom live and then have some more in-studio analysis. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm your host, Carissa Kranz, and we are live in the courtroom in the Shaun Harrison case, and a special welcome to our Sirius XM radios. I don't want to take much of your time because we have a live feed in the courtroom that we need to jump back to, but real quick, this is a crazy case out of Boston. A pastor, a reverend, a headmaster of a high school is accused of shooting a student in the back of his head, execution style, for a drug deal gone bad. Remember, this is a reverend who has a reputation of being an anti-gun, anti-violence activist in the community. And now we are learning that he is actually soliciting students, enlisting students that he's mentoring to help him sell drugs and using them to do his dirty work, specifically commit violence to other students, the victim in this case, Luis Rodriguez, for drug sales being down. Let's listen in to this new witness that just took the stand. Right now, we're listening to testimony from the Boston Police Crime Lab investigator, Doug Calabresi. He is significant and important because he is the one who, I think, we're listening in. I'm not positive yet, but it appears he's the one that got to examine the Reverend Shaun Harrison's cell phone, which is going to lend more evidence in the prosecution's case to build their case for an intent to murder charge for shooting the victim, the student, the 17-year-old boy, execution style in the back of his head for drug sales that have gone down. Let's listen in and see what else he has to say, and then we'll come back for some in-studio analysis. Again, this is the Boston Police Crime Lab investigator, Doug Calabresi, and right now they are authenticating the cell phone that he investigated, and we'll see why if we listen in. Okay, it looks like they're still authenticating it. For those of you listening in on Sirius Radio right now, it's quiet on screen. He's reviewing some papers. No real testimony yet that seems to be lending any insight into the case. But for those of you just joining us, we are live in the courtroom. We have a live feed. We are live on the network, Law and Crime, and we are live on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Carissa Kranz, and we are on channel 109. This case we are following right now is a case out of Boston. Shaun Harrison is a Boston pastor standing trial for shooting a 17-year-old boy he mentored in the back of his head, execution style on March 3rd, 2015. The young man survived and is testifying right now, or testifying in this trial and showing them who the perpetrator is. And he is pointing to and identifying in the courtroom the defendant, Shaun Harrison. With me is criminal defense attorney Andell Brown. Andell, how powerful is it to have the victim on the stand and point to the defendant and say, that's him, he did it? How do you recover from that as a defense attorney?
It is extremely powerful, as you know, Carissa. In most cases where it is actually a murder, that person is not there to tell their story, but we do have a living victim who survived to say, this is the person that did it to me. As a defense attorney looking at this particular case, you have to be able to damage the credibility of that person, or to be able to go after their ability to recall or to actually observe what they say they saw. In this case, the alleged victim was involved in criminal activity himself. He was using marijuana. He was under the influence of drugs at the time. And there seems to be a whole lot going on here. We've all heard the saying, there's no honor amongst thieves, and I would presume that it extends to drug dealers as well.
And I think you bring up a really interesting point here, because it's not just the fact that they're bringing in testimony, it's the fact that all the testimony, the victim and the defendant and all the witnesses, none of them are saintly, even though we're talking about a pastor who wants to have more religion in schools. All of them are involved in criminal activity. All of them have issues with credibility. All of that the jury is going to have to consider in their character evaluation of every witness and how credible their testimony is or isn't. I completely think that what you just said carries a lot of weight in this case, because we really don't know who to believe. And the video evidence is usually the best evidence, but the video evidence isn't very clear. Did you see the video?
I saw the video. The video doesn't really tell us a whole lot. It's grainy, it's dark, it's not clear who we're looking at in those videos. The only person that can tell us who's in the video is the alleged victim. This case all hinges on whether or not you believe the witnesses that the prosecution brings forth. If you believe them, you convict. If you don't, it's a not guilty. And that's really what this case boils down to.
Right. And so for those of you just listening in and not watching the screen, we're watching the video right now of the execution style shooting. And you can see the student shot in the back of his head, and then the alleged reverend, the pastor, is turning around and running away. And I say alleged because the video really isn't clear. Another video that we have to analyze that we can put up on screen is the one that happened earlier that day in the high school. Earlier that day, there was a fight in the school, and apparently, as you just saw, the victim was shoved down onto the floor by another student. And testimony is revealing that that attack was orchestrated and under the direction of the Reverend Shaun Harrison. He was soliciting other students to do his dirty work because of decreased weed sales. What do you make of this video, and how powerful is it? Or do you think it's just a coincidence that this happened on the same day?
Well, I think you have to take something like this very seriously. But I look at this video and I kind of look at the whole case. As a defense attorney, I would say that this looks like other people have issues with the alleged victim other than this accused pastor, this accused teacher, this dean of the school. If we take a step back and think about it, what we're saying is that all of the people who had a problem with this kid, the people who wanted to fight with him, the people who wanted to beat him up, now he gets shot and they're pointing their finger at the pastor. All of these kids have admitted in some form or fashion to be involved in illegal activity, to be involved in drug activity, possibly gang activity, and they're saying the pastor is the one who did it. He's the only one that's saying, I'm not involved in any illegal activity. I haven't done anything illegal. All I've done is try to keep kids out of trouble and keep guns off the street.
So you bring up an interesting point, right? So all of these witnesses are taking the stand and they are admitting that they're involved in illegal activity and crimes. What are the chances that charges could be brought against them?
Well, obviously, they've worked out some sort of deal with the prosecutor where they're going to have immunity. And that's another thing to look at from the side of the defense, saying, what are these guys getting out of it? They're getting the opportunity to come in here and testify and not be held accountable for their crimes. Why is that?
Right.
That's because the prosecution wants to win. And they'll allow these guys to get away with other crimes as long as they can help the prosecution win a conviction on this case.
Right. So flipping witnesses is a common thing in trials where many fingers can be pointed, and those that want to face a lesser charge or maybe get a plea bargain out of it will start flipping on other witnesses and give up testimony in exchange for immunity. That's a common thing. So that's a good point. For those of you just joining us now, right now we have a live feed in the courtroom. Looks like the judge was instructing the courtroom a minute ago. This is the case out of Boston. Shaun Harrison is standing trial for intent to murder a student that he mentored back in 2015 for shooting the student in the back of the head, execution style, for drug sales being down. The pastor stood for anti-gang violence, anti-gun violence. He was an upstanding member of the community, supposedly, but now we're learning he lived a double life. He was a Jekyll and Hyde type character. And we're learning about his double life of being involved in a drug ring, having access to guns and ammunition, and basically not being the person that he wanted us all to believe he is. But again, he's standing trial, so we don't have a conviction yet, and we don't know what's going to happen and how the jurors are deliberating or downloading all this evidence. We're not in deliberations yet. Right now, the jurors just went to the crime scene to go investigate it themselves and have just come back into court. And right now, we have a witness on the stand. It's a Boston Police Crime Lab investigator. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. Right now, we're listening into testimony in the Shaun Harrison trial. We have a witness on the stand. Her name is Jacqueline Masua, and she is a forensic analyst, and she is bringing in evidence right now. They are authenticating her as an expert to discuss gunpowder residue. With me, defense attorney Andell Brown. Andell, what do you think the prosecution is getting at with this testimony, and what is it that we can expect to hear?
Well, putting a witness like this on the stand, I would expect that they're going to be able to introduce some type of gunshot residue evidence, either found on the hands or the clothing of the defendant, that they would use to show that within the time frame alleged, he fired a gun. That's what I would expect to see when we're going to have this type of expert testify, or they're going to say that there wasn't residue or there were particles found and try to explain why that happened, even though he fired a gun.
Right, that's about what would make sense, and hopefully, if I were the prosecution as a former prosecutor, I would be wanting to bring in evidence to say, you know, we found the residue on his clothes, on the pastor's clothes. Sometimes these cases are built on circumstantial evidence, but in this case, we have the victim, right? The victim who said he did it. How strong? You've been following this case now for a few days. How strong is the prosecution's case, and do you think that defense can come back from a victim that survived a shooting and is pointing out in the courtroom, pointing out he did it?
I think the prosecution's case is strong, but I think on the defense side, it's definitely winnable. I think they have an argument. I haven't seen the prosecution provide that piece of evidence that I would say is a smoking gun, that there's probably no
so to speak, right? We have the forensic analyst right now talking about gunpowder.
Yeah, I'm waiting to see that. If the forensic, if they come back with some gunshot residue on his person or his clothing, that's going to be tough for the defense to overcome.
Now, do you think that would be a smoking gun? If they come back and say the reverend's clothes, the pastor's clothes had gun residue on it, and they are able to pin it to a time frame of when the shooting occurred, do you think that that's the smoking gun?
I think that's absolutely a smoking gun. The defense is going to have a really tough time if that turns out to be true.
Well, let's see, because right now they're introducing evidence in the courtroom. For those of you just listening in, they're introducing gloves right now. So let's listen into the courtroom live and see if there's any evidence on those gloves that link the reverend, the pastor, to actually pulling the trigger of the gun. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Carissa Kranz, your host, and with me I have criminal defense attorney Andell Brown, and we're here to provide some in-studio analysis with some what's going on live in the courtroom right now in the Shaun Harrison trial. This is out of Boston. The case where a reverend allegedly shot with the intent to kill a student that he mentored for a drug deal and drug sales gone bad. The reverend was leading a double life, allegedly, being an upstanding citizen of society, advocating against gun violence and drugs during the day. Well, and now we're hearing he was in school, at a high school, soliciting the students he mentored to actually help him sell drugs and commit violence. Andell, you know, this is a really interesting case with a lot of layers. And right now on the stand, for those of you listening and you don't see, the prosecution is admitting evidence for a witness who's a forensic analyst, and her job is to collect gunshot residue and link it to who may have committed the crime. What do you make out of what's being admitted right now into the courtroom?
Well, so far, Carissa, what we've seen are the clothing that apparently belonged to the victim, Luis Rodriguez here, and I'm sure she's looking.
Right. Okay. I think we're having a bit of an audio problem. What Andell is trying to say is that this is the clothing of the victim that is being admitted into evidence by the prosecution for Jacqueline Masua, the forensic analyst, who is being authenticated as the expert to lend some testimony on and whether or not it's important. If Andell, if we don't have an audio problem, we can jump back to you and you can continue to. Okay, can you hear me now? Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. Yeah, the forensic analyst is just looking at the physical evidence from the scene. It looks like these items were collected from the hospital off of Mr. Rodriguez, the alleged victim in this case. And it appears she's analyzed them not only for gunshot residue, but any DNA evidence that she could gain to see who used these clothing, whether or not they belong, the DNA that she's looking at belongs to the alleged victim, whether they belong to the defendant.
If you see here, if you're watching the screen, for those of you listening, the person handing her the evidence is wearing gloves, and she's wearing gloves as she's looking at the evidence to inspect it, to authenticate it, and before it's admitted into evidence as being the actual items that she inspected. So that goes to what you're saying about DNA.
Yeah, they have to maintain the integrity of the evidence, make sure it's not contaminated or ruined in any form or fashion so that the jurors can trust the results and the testimony that they're getting from this evidence and this expert.
Right. Well, and part of maintaining the integrity is authenticating the chain of custody. Do you, as a lawyer, you've probably admitted lots of evidence into, like this, hard evidence, physical evidence. How important is the chain of custody? And for those of us that aren't lawyers, let's break it down. What is chain of custody and why is that important?
Well, the chain of custody is absolutely important. If that chain is broken, if we can't trust that the evidence was collected in a way that we can rely on and preserve and maintain properly, then we can't admit that evidence. We can't admit that piece of evidence into the actual trial because we can't rely on it. We can't rely on its integrity. For instance, if you look at these various pieces of evidence that is either being handed to her or she presents, they're usually sealed, and they're sealed. They have names, they have dates, they have the names of the individuals that have handled them. Each and every person that has handled this piece of evidence has to account for how it was handled. Each and every area this evidence was, every test that's done, it has to be preserved properly so that once it comes to the court, we can trust the results are actually reflective.
Right. Okay. All right, Andell, yes, thank you. I think you cut out again a little bit there with the audio, but it is important. The chain of custody is critical, and in the end, the jurors get to listen to all the evidence that's admitted, including the testimony and the direct evidence and the physical evidence. It's all going to be admitted, and then they get to decide based on the totality of the circumstances how they wish to come down on a decision. We're going to continue to evaluate this and analyze this together. Andell Brown, criminal defense attorney, is going to stick with us on set, and you should stick with us too, but we have to throw to a quick break. Stay with us. Thank you, Anthony. And yes, that's true. He's facing all of those charges, and he pled not guilty to all of them. He says, "It's not me. I didn't do it. I'm the Rev." With me, criminal defense attorney Andell Brown is here to dissect this case and dive deeper into it with some in-studio analysis. Andell, thank you for staying with me here. We have some key testimony. Kevin Perez, another student at the school who was solicited by the Rev, how he likes to call himself, to sell drugs and help him participate in this gang-like activity. What do you make of Kevin's testimony so far? And then after that, we're going to jump back into his direct examination so the audience can hear some of his key testimony.
Kevin's testimony is bad for the Rev, as they call him, if you believe Kevin. One of the things that the defense attorneys got Kevin to admit is that he's given testimony previously that wasn't truthful. He didn't mention when he first spoke to police that the Rev asked him to shoot Mr. Rodriguez. He never mentioned it in the grand jury testimony.
Would you say he wasn't truthful or he didn't remember? Because
no, he said he wasn't truthful. He actually got him to admit that at times he wasn't truthful in what he testified to. And I think that's a big deal if that's one of the state's star witnesses to this crime, is that, the defense has shown that he's someone that, at least in some instances, should not be believed.
So you're a true criminal defense attorney. I'm a former prosecutor, and I would say I would totally disagree with that.
Well, look, if the guy says I lied, I mean, there's no way to get around that.
I didn't hear I lied. I heard this was 3 years ago. I don't remember. And maybe he didn't come forward and saying certain things right away because he was maybe intimidated. But I didn't hear I lied.
I mean, that might be the explanation. But when the defense
Well,
attorney
that's a
asked
criminal
him,
defense attorney's a narrative. I have to give you credit for that one.
He said you weren't truthful. He said yes, and that comes in evidence. And I would absolutely use that and take it to the bank, because if the guy's saying I wasn't forthcoming, I wasn't truthful, I'm going to say, look, we have a bunch of crooks and liars here, and we have a reverend on the other side. Who are we going to believe? The guy that's been helping the community for 55 years, or these kids that are running around selling drugs and beating each other up in school?
You're hired. If I were the Rev, I'd hire you because you're throwing in all those mitigating factors. But what about the testimony from the witness that we're going to hear from, that he said, I was there in school and I saw the drugs in his desk. I saw weapons in his desk. He asked me to sell drugs for him. He asked me to attack the victim, Luis Rodriguez, for him. I heard him ask someone else to attack the victim for him. Yes, he's the Reverend, and yes, that comes with a high profile. But what about all this other testimony, including the neighbor we heard from yesterday, who said that she saw drugs and weapons and ammunition in his storage unit and went into his house and it smelled like weed, and she spoke about the foot traffic. So I think
that is the toughest part for the defense to overcome. I think that's the evidence that really is hard to refute, because they found guns, ammunition, and drugs in his home. The neighbor's saying there's guns, ammunition, and drugs in his storage unit. Why does a pastor who's anti-guns, anti-drugs, anti-violence have all of these things in his home? I think that's what the prosecution has to hang their hat on.
Right.
The testimony of these guys that are asking for immunity for this or that, and the prosecution is promising they won't, get into whatever other crimes they committed. I don't think that testimony holds a lot of weight. But if you're going to go with the evidence, it has to be what's at his house, what the neighbor didn't do anything bad to anybody. So we can believe her testimony. I think that's the toughest thing for the defense to overcome.
And I can appreciate your defense strategy right now. As I said, I'd hire you. You've done a pretty good job trying to make your case for the Rev, the pastor here. So you just admitted, Andell Brown, criminal defense attorney, with me here to dissect this. You just said this would be really hard for the defense to come back from. And why does a reverend, why does a pastor have guns and ammunition and drugs in his possession? So, as a defense attorney, how do you come back from that? Do you put your defendant on the stand? Do you think the jurors need to hear from him in this case? If this were your case, would you put him on the stand?
Well, obviously, that's a decision you make with your client on whether or not you put them on the stand.
What would your recommendation be?
I would tell them, if in this case, knowing what I know, you have to explain those things. And even though perhaps Massachusetts might have different laws, having guns and ammunition is not illegal. The only thing that's illegal is having marijuana. We have to ask ourselves whether this is marijuana that's in an amount that's for sale, or is this an amount for personal use? If the reverend has an issue with drugs, he should own up to it and tell the jury about it. And, guns are not illegal, but drugs are.
But he may have had illegal possession of the guns. You're right. We have the right to bear arms, Second Amendment right. Doesn't mean that he had the right to be in possession of those guns, though. I believe one of the charges was illegal possession of drugs, firearms, and ammunition. So really,
I don't have any special circumstances that make it illegal for him to have firearms, whether he has any previous convictions or anything like that. But other than that, I'm not sure what they're basing that on. But in general, that's not a problem. You can have as many guns and ammunition in your home as you want. There's no law against that.
Certainly makes for a Jekyll and Hyde type character. For those of you just joining us, we are live in the courtroom, live on Sirius Radio, and you can download us on our app. I'm your host, Carissa Kranz, and we are watching and dissecting in the courtroom the Shaun Harrison trial. This is the case out of Boston, where a pastor, is accused of intent to murder of a 17-year-old boy for shooting him in the back of his head, execution style. Because why? decreased drug sales, slumping weed sales. We've listened to testimony for the last few days. The prosecution is still putting on their case. And right now, we're going to listen to some key testimony from Kevin Perez, another student at the high school, a prosecution witness. We're in direct examination right now. And he says some key testimony that's important because it actually puts the Reverend in the position of having drugs in his possession, weapons in his possession, and using his position of power to use students that he mentors to actually commit crimes on his behalf. Let's listen in.
First.
That's Kevin Perez, a prosecution witness on direct examination, pointing his finger at the defendant, identifying him in the courtroom, saying the Reverend Shaun Harrison showed him at school drugs, weapons, a knife. He was just saying this big. He was using his hands and showing the size, and pretty much giving some damning evidence that the defense is going to have to get out of. So, speaking of defense strategy, let's bring on with me criminal defense attorney Andell Brown. Andell, we were speaking earlier in the show about Kevin Perez, this witness, and you were saying why he's not credible. We're going to go into some cross-examination in a minute, but before we do, what would be your strategy on cross-examination to bring out your point that he's not truthful and that he's not credible and that the jury should not believe him?
Well, I would go with a few things. Number one, the various conflicting statements he's given, whether they directly conflict or he's omitted very important information. The fact that he says that the defendant told him he wanted him to harm Luis Rodriguez, he never told anyone, didn't go to a cop or anyone like that. And then let's look at this video we just saw. We saw a friend of his attack Luis Rodriguez, and where was Kevin? He was right behind him. He didn't look like he was going in there to help. He looked like he was part of the attack. If you follow the sequence of events, we have Luis Rodriguez attacked by his friend and then later on shot. Yes, I would.
Okay. Right. So the video on the screen right now shows him being attacked, and then it has a circle, a yellow circle drawn around the witness on the stand right now, Kevin Perez, and the role that he played, and why his testimony is credible, because it actually shows him there. But, you know, I have to say and disagree with you again, Andell.
Please do.
Okay. So you're saying that what he said isn't truthful because he didn't report it. But isn't it possible, and not only possible, isn't it reasonable that a student would be afraid or intimidated to report something incriminating against their superior, a position of power, their reverend, someone that is actually also mentoring them while also soliciting them and recruiting them to do bad acts? This is a person of power. I would argue that's not really untruthful as much as it is he's in a compromised position and he doesn't really know what to do. He's a minor. He's a child. He's in high school.
And that's a great argument, and I can see why you were such a brilliant prosecutor in your time. And what I would say to that is, what is also reasonable is he's going to protect his friend, his buddy, the guy that's getting in trouble with him, the person we actually saw attack Luis Rodriguez on that video. They're looking out for each other. They're covering for each other. That's what friends do, and that's what's reasonable here. So instead of pointing the finger at the person who actually attacked Luis Rodriguez earlier that very same day, let's point the finger someplace else, a place where we don't have anything other than our word to prove what happened. All they can say is, we say he's told us to sell marijuana. We say he told us that he's going to hurt this guy because he owes him money. But we don't have anything else to corroborate it but these guys' words. And we've heard many instances where their word just didn't stand up, didn't hold water.
Well, that is a great narrative and great speculation, counselor. Let's listen in on cross-examination and see if this defense attorney does as well as you would do if you were defending this case.
Sure.
Thank you, Anthony. Those are the top crime stories of the day. But right now, we are watching the Shaun Harrison trial live in the courtroom. And with me, I have Andell Brown, criminal defense attorney. Before our break, Andell and I discussed Kevin Perez, who's currently on the stand right now. We're listening to his testimony. We listened to direct examination. And Andell told me his strategy for cross-examination. Right now, we're in the middle of cross-examination and listening to that testimony. Before we jump back into it, I want to ask you, counselor, how do you think it's going?
I think it's going great. If I was a defense lawyer, I would be very pleased with the direction things are taking. I think one of the things that you want to bring out is Shaun Harrison a mastermind or not? I mean, he's so smart that he has everyone fooled. Yet he's so dumb that he's asking a guy that turned him down on selling weed. And then he says, you know what, let me go ahead and ask you to do my dirty work since you've already turned me down. So if I was a defense attorney, I think things would be going great. And I'd be just waiting to lay out the bait so I can get him on closing argument.
Okay, so I don't really want to agree with you because I've had a theme in this show of not agreeing with you. But I'm going to say I don't like the fact, if I were the prosecutor in this case and prosecuting this case, I don't like the fact that the witness, Kevin Perez, is getting defensive on cross-examination. The fact that he's getting defensive, Andell, are you still with me? Can we put him back up with me? I want to see his facial expressions. There you go, Andell. I mean, when you see a witness getting defensive and kind of sarcastic, I do think it takes away from their credibility. So I don't want to agree with you. Let me just make that clear. But I am going to agree that this witness is losing a little bit of credibility on cross-examination. What do you make of his overall? Do you see what I see, his overall demeanor on the stand? Because remember, not everyone sees what we see. We do have radio listeners. So I see, you know, his facial expressions. His eyes are kind of rolling. He seems kind of like ready to fight, but he's on the stand. So he's got his suit on, but he's ready to go, and he doesn't like being challenged. That's what I see. He doesn't like being challenged.
And, you know, jurors absolutely, like most people, they do not like smart alecky people, the people that seem to want to be sarcastic and arrogant on the stand. They want to fight over things that really aren't fights. The judge had to step in to get him to answer a question. So I think you're absolutely right. It takes away from what they're really there to talk about, which is their testimony. And I know that you always prepared your witnesses and told them that, you know, that's not something they want to do on the stand. But unfortunately, it doesn't look like he heard that part, or maybe his prosecutor in this case didn't let him know that.
Well, they could always take a break and, you know, have a talk with their witness or do a sidebar and ask for a break. But in this case, you're right. He is smart alecky. He is a little sarcastic. And we're on cross-examination of Kevin Perez. This is the Shaun Harrison trial out of Boston, March 2015 case where the pastor is accused of shooting with the intent to kill, execution style, a student that he mentored in the back of his head for decreased weed sales. Let's go back into the courtroom and listen to this witness, Kevin Perez, on cross-examination and see how he holds up, and we'll come back to some studio analysis. Andell, stick with me if you can. Kevin Perez, ladies and gentlemen, a prosecution witness on cross-examination. And I can say, let's bring our defense attorney back on, Andell Brown. This is not going well on cross-examination. For the viewers that are just listening and not actually viewing that screen, what I just witnessed right there is Kevin Perez, the witness. He's getting defensive. He's starting to speak ghetto speak of, may you repeat yourself, but come again type of language. He's leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms and being, all closed off. Body language speaks volumes. What do you make of this cross-examination? Successful? or not?
Successful for the defense thus far. I mean, he's showing himself to be the choir boy that, I thought he would be. He would show himself to be in cross-examination. Of course, I myself am using a bit of sarcasm. I think his defensive posture, his argumentative posture, his at times lack of respect for the attorney, for the court, for the reverence of being in a courtroom, I think are beginning to show through when he's folding his arms, when he's sighing, when he appears to be rolling his eyes. It doesn't seem like he's taking this seriously. It doesn't seem like he understands that these people are just here to do their job, and he's fighting as if he's personally being attacked because he's being asked about what he testified to earlier. He does not like the fact.
We're going to have to go to a quick break, but after this break, we're going to come back to this testimony. We'll continue to analyze this together, so stay with us. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm your host, Carissa Kranz, and we are live on Sirius Radio, live in the courtroom and live in the network, which you can download on our app and you can watch us there. We are covering the Shaun Harrison trial out of Boston, a case where a reverend, a pastor, a headmaster of a high school, an English high school, is accused of intent to murder a student that he mentored. The reason? A drug deal gone bad, low weed sales, a reverend holding himself out to be a man of conviction, and now he might be convicted. This Jekyll and Hyde character holds himself out to be an anti-gun, an anti-violence activist, and yet at the same time is soliciting and recruiting students that he's mentoring to work for him, to sell drugs for him, and to actually commit violence on his behalf when drug deals are not going the way he would like for them to go. Right now we are listening to cross-examination of Kevin Perez, another student at the school who is a prosecution witness, but he gave a strong case for the prosecution, but on cross-examination seems to be not going so well. Criminal defense attorney Andell Brown is with me, and right before we went to the break, we were analyzing this testimony, and Andell was saying, Andell, you're still with me. There you are. You
Yes,
were saying how the lack of respect in the courtroom, the argumentative behavior, the body language of crossing your arms and breathing heavy and rolling your eyes is exactly what you would be looking for in cross-examination as a defense attorney. And I agree, from the state's perspective, this cross-examination isn't going well. You were cut off right at the break, so I want you to pick up and let everyone know what you were trying to say and finish that thought, because this isn't going well on
Thank
cross.
you, Carissa.
I still think the case is going well for the state, by the way, but I don't think this cross-examination is going well.
I think the state has a good amount of evidence, but I think these witnesses are problematic. I'm not sure that they're helping the state's case, particularly this witness. I think the things he's saying they just don't really make sense along the lines of him being the defendant, Rev, being a mastermind and saying these dumb statements. But even further, his demeanor, his attitude, the mindset, the way he walks through the court, the way he carries himself seems to be as if he's a street guy, as if he's the gangster, as if he's the type of person that engages in illicit, illegal activities, and he's the type of person to play fast and loose with the truth for his own benefit. And that's what I would be arguing if I was on the defense side in this case. I would argue that he has every reason to not be true.
Right, and I would agree that, during direct examination, for those of you that watched it and even listened, Kevin Perez seemed much more put together. He seemed much more professional. He has his suit on. He's more poised. His voice is calmer. And then we go to cross-examination, and just like the pastor is a Jekyll and Hyde type character, this witness is almost a Jekyll and Hyde type character. We now see the student that poised himself, postured himself on direct examination to say, I turned down the reverend and pastor. I refused to sell drugs. I refused to hurt the victim with my own hands. I'm an upstanding person. I didn't partake in these criminal activities. And now we see him on cross-examination, and he's getting defensive, and he's going into attack mode. But he knows he can't attack because he's in a court of law. And you are seeing this, like you said, street kid who looked professional now turn a little gangster on us in the courtroom. Not going so well on cross-examination for the state. Let's jump back into the courtroom and listen into more cross-examination from Kevin Perez and see what the jury is actually going to hear and take back to them with them to the deliberation room at the end of the case. Thank you, Anthony. Those are the top crime stories of the day. But now we're watching our main trial, the Shaun Harrison trial. And this is a Boston case where a reverend, a pastor, a headmaster is standing trial for intent to murder of a student that he mentored in a high school. The student was shot in the back of the head, execution style. And the motive seems to be decreased weed sales. That's what's coming out during the prosecution's case. And right now, the prosecution is still putting on their case. We just heard before the break from Kevin Perez on cross-examination. And with me is criminal defense attorney Andell Brown. Andell, you and I both agree that cross-examination is not going so well. But I still think the state's case is pretty strong. What do you think?
I think the state's case it's strong, but I don't think it's all the way beyond a reasonable doubt at this point, based on the evidence I've heard. I think there's some questions to be answered that I have not seen being answered up to this point. I think one of those questions is when they talk about this motive, they say decreased weed sales is the reason that this reverend, this anti-violence, anti-gun activist, 55-year-old teacher, dean of the school there, decided to take the life or try to take the life of Luis Rodriguez. And I just don't see how that makes a lot of sense. Typically, when you're talking about marijuana and marijuana dealers, unless they're dealing in bulk, it's a very low-level crime. It's not a whole lot of money involved. I mean, seriously, how much money could this high school kid have owed? Probably selling weed to other high school kids, that Shaun Harrison would decide to throw away his career, throw away his life, and try to commit murder for the first time at 55 years of age. I just don't see how that makes sense. Either he's the mastermind the state casts him to be, or he's just not very bright, and he can't be both at the same time.
Right. Well, the jurors are instructed to use their common sense, so if it doesn't make sense to you, maybe it won't make sense to them. But we'll see. There's been a Jekyll and Hyde character here of the Reverend for sure, and there's been Jekyll and Hyde characters among these witnesses as well, including the victim. Right now, if you're watching us on the screen, we have in the courtroom a live feed, and a witness, Jacqueline Massou, she's a forensic analyst, and she collects gunpowder residue and analyzes it. Earlier, she was admitting evidence from the victim, taken from his clothes from the hospital, to analyze it. Then the court took a quick break, but she's back on the stand live, discussing some evidence that's being admitted and authenticating it. We discussed the chain of custody earlier today on how important it is to keep the chain of custody pure, so the evidence that's admitted is as authentic and uncontaminated as possible. Let's go back into the courtroom live and listen into what she has to say. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. That is Jacqueline Massou on the stand. She is a forensic analyst, and she collects gun residue powder. She is identifying articles of clothing in bags, in evidence, saying what she evaluated and took DNA swabs of. She's explaining it. It seems a little mundane. It seems a little repetitive, but it's important, right? Everything's important. Everything is evidence, and the steps to admit it into evidence and to discuss it And to prove that chain of custody is essential to know that what we're relying on as evidence is actually truthful and as complete as possible. With me, Andell Brown, criminal defense attorney. We haven't heard anything critical from this witness yet, Jacqueline Masua. But what do you anticipate we're going to hear, and why is what all going through the motions of what she's going through right now on the stand important?
I think it's important to establish a foundation for the forensic evidence and how it was collected. I think a lot of what she's gone through is the victim's clothing and personal items and other things like that. I think she's trying to establish what exactly happened, where the gunshot residue was, and the positioning of those items, what they show. What I would hope she's up there to prove for the prosecution's sake is that they can relate some of this gunshot residue or the DNA back to the defendant in this case, Mr. Harrison, Rev, as they've been calling him, that she's going to be able to tie those two together, because that will be the smoke evidence involved in it.
Right, so that would be the smoking gun evidence, like you just said, that they've been waiting for. I lost you a little bit of the audio in my ear. I'm not sure if the listeners and viewers lost you as well on that final thought. But I do think there is enough other evidence to prove this case beyond any and all reasonable doubt. But then again, we haven't heard the defense case yet. Prosecution's still putting on their case. And let's listen in, because she's on the stand right now and it seems like she's being asked some questions.